Let's look at news values. What makes something news? And so in many ways, these are audience driven. What does the audience want to see? What does the audience want to hear? And the news organizations respond accordingly. So you'll recognize some of these. Maybe you never knew the names of them, but you'll say, oh yeah, that's what I gravitate toward if I'm going to look at something, read something, or listen to something. First, let's look at one of Roxanne's rules for writing, and it's called Beware of the Curse of Knowledge. The curse of knowledge is that factor in life where we understand something, but the other person might not. So this happens in our personal lives where we might have a disagreement with a friend or family member because we felt as though that person should have known what we were meant to say or wanted, but that person doesn't know. So how is that person going to know, for example, that you like chocolate unless the person sees you eating chocolate all the time or you tell the person you like chocolate? So we can't read one another's minds, and that is also true for the audience. So the audience doesn't know anything about what it is that you're trying to communicate. So it's important not to omit small details in a story that we understand, but we forget that the audience is new to the story. So we have to remember that. And it's a skill you want to develop where you can put yourself in the audience's shoes. So you can take a step back maybe and look and see what it is that you need to tell people so that they understand the full scope of the story. It's a good idea to memorize what news is. So news is a truthful, comprehensive account of the day's events in a context that gives them meaning. So news is truthful. That means we can't leave out any details on all sides of the story. We have to lay out what's going on to the audience, and the audience can make a decision about whether to believe the person, not to believe the person. It's not our job to do that. Our job is to put the facts out there and let the audience decide. So that's what comprehensive is. We're going to attack all sides of the story as much as we can to let people know what's going on. And context often is sometimes an event occurs where there have been some things in the past that deal with that event. So the context is, how does this fit in to a bigger picture if there is one? So you want to be well read. You want to understand your sources. You want to understand those people and organizations about which you write or do video or audio so that you can put those stories in context. So again, let's look at news values. What makes an event news? One of the first ones is called impact, and that's an event that changes lives. So some events have huge impact over a wide geographical area. And so 9/11 affected the world, really. So you may have been small at the time this happened, or maybe you were older, maybe you weren't even born yet. But those of us who lived through 9/11 can count the ways that that event changed our lives. Some events are more local, and that definitely changed lives. So a few years ago, there was a flood in the Baton Rouge area and the surrounding communities. And some of those communities were maybe 90% affected, where people's homes and businesses were flooded. They couldn't move back home for quite a while, and it changed their lives. So that event has impact locally, but for example, in a place like Nebraska, people there might not even know that that happened. So impact can be local, it can be regional, it can be national, and it can be international. Timeliness is really one of the most important news values because without this element, we really couldn't have news. In other words, this event occurred, this was when LSU won the National Football Championship, and that was in early January of 2020. But now, after that, if we were going to talk about this story again, we would need a hook to reintroduce it because it would be old news. So, right after the game, you saw news stories that talked about the score, talked about some of the things that happened during the game. But after that, you would have seen stories, maybe feature stories on individuals, what a lot of the football players were going to do decision wise. Would they stay at LSU? Would they leave? And so these became old news. And we needed to change that in some way. So here are some things that are the Houston flood was regional, but to people who live in Houston, Texas, you would see another hook about that story as the anniversary of the flood passed. Same thing with Christmas, occurs every year in December, but we see a story about how a family celebrates Christmas or why that holiday has meaning to us. Same thing with 9/11, Hurricane Katrina for those people in South Louisiana and South Mississippi, World War II. The flood of 2016 is what it's called in the Baton Rouge and surrounding communities. That was that picture that I just showed you. So on the anniversaries of those events, you would see something that news people call a hook. How can we introduce an event that is not timely and then make it timely? Now, prominence, those are people who make news because they're well known. So, public figures, celebrities, those people have prominence. Public officials, people that we vote for, people who are appointed to high level positions, those people are prominent. Nobody really cares about what I eat, but we can see pictures of celebrities like a Kardashian or Angelina Jolie and see what they're eating. And so even funny things like that become news to us because people have prominence. Anything the President of the United States says or does is typically news, whereas if I would do it, nobody would really want to know about that. So that's what prominence is, and it's something that, again, the audience gravitates toward. Proximity is important because you need to know your audience. You need to know what's important to the people in your community. And so proximity means events that are close to home. So here at LSU in Baton Rouge, we love Mike. So he's a lot of fun. He has his own Twitter account, his own Facebook page, his own Instagram page. And even though I personally know the voice of Mike, who's behind that, it's funny when I read his Twitter page, I think it's really Mike. So lots of fun here. But Mike might not be any importance to somebody who lives in Idaho, unless that person's from Baton Rouge. Now, proximity can also be psychological. Maybe it's not something that is geographical, but maybe it's a cause you care about, something that's of concern to you. So maybe you have a relative who suffers from a particular type of cancer. So you might see an article about that was written in San Francisco, but that's important to you, and so it has proximity in your life. Currency is a funny sounding news value. What that means is that issues have current interest. So, one thing that is newsworthy today might not be newsworthy tomorrow because something that has more news value actually pushes it out of the way, is the best way I can describe it. So, there was a story in the summer of 2001. An intern in Washington, D.C., her name was Chandra Levy. She was found dead, and nobody knew what happened, and so there was a lot of speculation. And what happened was we heard about this story just about every day. And so there was a congressman, Gary Condit. He was suspected of having something to do with her disappearance. And so that became part of the story. So any news shows or things that you tend to watch on the weekends that go into a little bit more detail would usually mention him. And so that was in the news quite often. Well, on September 11th, 2001, we had two airplanes, passenger jets, fly into the World Trade Center towers. and nobody talked about this, what happened to Chandra Levy. Really, again, if you saw a story about it, it would be buried inside of the newspaper. Maybe you'd find out about it. In fact, about a year ago, I saw a story where they found the person who committed the crime. And Gary Condon didn't have anything to do with it, but it changed his life. But we didn't hear about it anymore because 9/11 pushed that out of the way and actually pushed a lot of other news out of the way once that happened that year. So, conflict is really what it is. Anytime you have two sides that are in a disagreement, that's a conflict. And so you can have serious conflict, war, things that are cause people great concern. You can also have the kind of conflict that we like. We like football games, sporting events. That's two sides against each other. That's why shows like some of those talk shows where people are at each other's throats, that's conflict. It's unusual, and so we gravitate toward it. We might not even like it, but for whatever reason, we feel stuck in it when it comes on the TV. This is probably the most fun of all the news values, at least I think so. These are bizarre or unusual things. And so these are all stories that are true. This chameleon on a thumb is a real deal. I have a friend in Africa who sent me a picture. This is not her picture, of a little tiny chameleon that she had as a pet, and it was sitting on her thumb. So that's the real thing. Just because you see it on the internet doesn't always make it true. But again, a lot of that stuff is for real. And so we might not have any news values. Grandma who chases attackers on a child scooter, she doesn't live in our hometown. We don't know who she is. She has no impact on us. There's may not even be timeliness attached to it. But because it's bizarre, unusual, we will read it. This driver pulls a backward stunt for more than a mile of traffic is a video of a traffic cam that catches this driver going backwards down the interstate, making turns, and parking perfectly in a parking lot, right? And so I think this was in the Midwest. I can't even remember where it was now. It has no value to me. I live in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, but it's just so unusual that I wanted to watch it. And so the more news values that an event has, the longer we will talk about it, the more we will read about it, the more interest that we'll have in it. So anything that has all the news values tends to be part of the public conversation for quite a while. So think about news values when you present it with a set of facts and decide. This helps you to decide what goes at the top of the story and what doesn't need to go at the top of the story. So keep a list of news values and refer to them often.